Lacanian psychoanalysis breaks down the human mind into three main parts: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary is all about the images we imagine or perceive, like the pictures we see in dreams or when we think. The symbolic is about language and how it shapes our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. The real is something beyond our imagination and language, almost like an abstract concept that we cannot fully grasp. These three parts are always connected, but there is a significant moment in a person's development called the mirror stage, around 18 months old. This is when a child sees itself in a mirror and start to realize that it is separate from the rest of the world. After this stage, our perception becomes influenced by language, and our sense of self is tied to the images we see and the words we use. So, in Lacanian theory, our conscious thoughts and ego are shaped by what we see, while our unconscious mind is structured by language. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, the formation of the ego begins with what is known as the mirror stage, where the child sees itself in a mirror and starts to develop a sense of self. This image the child sees in the mirror becomes a crucial reference point for its own identity. However, this initial self image clashes with the identity they form through language and interactions with others, leading to a perpetual struggle to reconcile these two aspects. This process mirrors Hegel's idea of the dialectic between subjective and objective spirit. But unlike Hegel's resolution, Lacan suggests there is no ultimate reconciliation between the two. As the child progresses through the mirror stage, it transitions from identifying objects based solely on appearance to understanding them within the context of language and symbolic structures. This transition marks a shift from purely instinctual behaviors to the integration of conscious logic. Language plays a pivotal role in solidifying the differentiation between self and other, as it leads the subject to perceive themselves as active constructors of their reality. This contrasts with the initial unity perceived in the mirror, highlighting the complexity of human perception and identity formation. Before the mirror stage, infants experience images in their minds without any hierarchy or specific viewpoint. These images are like pure perceptions, not influenced by thoughts or concepts. This state is considered the real, a primal state before any distinctions are made. However, during the mirror stage, when a child sees itself in a mirror, it starts forming a sense of self or ego. This new self-image clashes with the earlier, more unified, leading to a sense of fragmentation and conflict between what they see in the mirror and how they perceive themselves without language or concepts. As the child grows, its ego becomes a defense mechanism against this fragmentation, preserving the distinction between themselves and what they perceive. This process is reinforced by language and symbolic structures, which further alienate the subject from their perceptions. The subject finds certainty and identity by identifying with what they perceive. But this also creates a constant tension between the subjective experience and the external world. This tension mirrors Hegel's idea of self-alienation in consciousness, where the subject's sense of self is dependent on its perception of objects. Hegel discusses how the self defines itself in relation to what it is not. This idea is reflected in the development of the self mirror stage, where a person's experience does not match their identity, and this gap is reinforced by language. Hegel suggests that reason, or the symbolic aspect of the self, cannot fully overcome the imaginary aspect, which is tied to perception and images. This continuous tension between reason and the imaginary creates desire, as reason keeps trying to reconcile with what it perceives as its other self. According to Lacan, becoming truly human happens when we enter into a symbolic relationship through language. Language shapes how we see ourselves and the world, and this self perception is influenced by the imaginary aspect. However, the symbolic nature of language also creates a divide within us, where our conscious ego, represented by words, resists fully merging with our unconscious thoughts and desires. This divide is symbolized by the pronoun I, which represents us but also keeps us separate from the chain of language, highlighting the complexity of our self awareness and identity formation. When we enter into language, we also enter into what Lacan calls the other. This other is like a shared system of rules, beliefs, and customs that language creates. It is what shapes society and determines how we interact with each other. However, this also means that we become somewhat alienated from ourselves as we are both influenced by and excluded from these rules and norms. According to Lacan, our unconscious mind is structured by this language and is essentially the discourse of this other representing our self image as it's represented in language. This idea of the other was influenced by Claude Lévi-Strauss, who saw society as a collection of symbolic systems, with language being the most important one. Levi-Strauss argued that these symbols are even more real than the things they represent, and they determine how we behave and relate to each other. Lacan further developed this notion, suggesting that the dominance of language and social rules over our natural instincts shapes our behavior and understanding of ourselves. Essentially, language becomes the primordial law that governs human society and individual identity, leaving us somewhat alienated from our true selves within its linguistic order. The L schema of Lacan is a diagram that shows the different aspects of a person's identity: the ego, the unconscious mind, the other, which represents language and social norms, and the other person or object in perception. The relationship between the ego and the other person is based on conscious perception and desire, where the ego seeks validation from the other. However, this relationship is actually determined by the deeper connection between the unconscious mind and language. This means that our conscious actions are influenced by unconscious processes, and our sense of self is shaped by language and societal norms. The ego tries to assert itself in relationships and desires validation from others, but this ego is actually a construct based on our perception of ourselves. It is influenced by the images we see of ourselves and the language we use. This resistance of the ego to the unconscious mind is like the resistance of meaning to language, and it makes it difficult for us to truly understand ourselves or others. Relationships between individuals are often based on false representations of ourselves in language, leading to misunderstanding sense of separation from each other. In Lacan's Seminar 2, he suggests that the true reality of who we are lies in our unconscious mind, not in our conscious ego. He explains that while our ego or sense of self may seem clear and immediate to us, it does not fully capture our true essence. The reality of our unconscious, which is excluded from our conscious awareness, is where the genuine expression of ourselves lies. Lacan emphasizes that language, while useful for communication, cannot fully represent the complexities of our inner selves. Instead, it creates gaps or absences that reveal its limitations in capturing the full scope of human experience. Lacan criticizes Freud and classical psychology for the reliance on conscious perception and language in understanding the human mind. He argues that they often overlook the aspects of our experience that do not neatly fit into these frameworks, such as jokes, slips of the tongue, and other linguistic quirks that reveal deeper layers of our unconscious. According to Lacan, our sense of self is constructed through language, but it is a dynamic and ongoing process, constantly shaped by our interactions with the world and with others. He introduces the concept of the anchoring point or point de capiton, where the subject's self-conception intersects with language, but this conception is always in flux and can only be understood in hindsight. Lacan explains that our understanding of ourselves in language is limited because our true selves, especially our unconscious aspects, cannot fully be captured by words. We can only catch glimpses of ourselves like seeing a reflection in a mirror. But this reflection does not show the whole picture. There is a gap between what we think we are and what we truly are, which Lacan calls the elided subject. This absence in language makes it hard for us to recognize our true selves, as we are stuck in a cycle of only seeing what we want to see about ourselves. That to understand ourselves is often hindered by a misunderstanding where we mistake what we want for something else. This misunderstanding protects us from fully facing our desires and the complexities of our true selves. The ego, our sense of self, tries to fill in this gap by creating an imaginary version of ourselves that we present to the world. However, this imaginary self is only a temporary replacement for our true selves, and the gap between what we perceive and what truly exists can never be fully bridged. This gap, Lacan argues, is where our true selves reside, hidden from language and representation. Lacan describes the unconscious as existing in the space between two people or two words. It is like a gap where illusion of the ego or a sense of self is revealed as just a representation. In this gap, the true essence of the self, which cannot fully be captured by language, becomes apparent. The structure of the self is complex, with moments of presence and absence weaving in and out as language moves along. These gaps and absences show us that our understanding of ourselves is never complete, and Freud missed this because he did not have the tools of structural linguistics to fully grasp it. The idea of the imaginary ideal ego comes from the mirror stage, where infants first recognize themselves in a mirror. This ideal ego is like a picture perfect version of ourselves, formed from what we see and how we identify with objects around us. It is different from the ego we present in language, which is shaped by how we communicate with others. Language transforms our subjective selves into objective ones, but even then, our understanding of ourselves is always changing and never fully solid. Hegel's idea of perception, where we see things as universal rather than just singular, ties into this concept, highlighting the difference between how we see ourselves subjectively and how we are represented objectively in language. For Hegel, the various shapes and forms we perceive are like variations on reality, much like the embroidered veil in Plato's allegory of the cave. These appearances act as a barrier between what we perceive with our senses and the deeper universal truths that lie beyond. Similarly, Lacan sees a division between the imaginary and symbolic realms, where perception is on the other. Objects in perception, solidified in language, represent the negation of otherness, both for Hegel and Lacan. This means that what we perceive and how we represent it in language are intertwined in a complex dance between the individual and the universal, the finite and the infinite. Lacan talks about the imaginary ideal ego as a kind of fictional direction where the ego exists before social influences shape it. This ideal ego remains somewhat elusive, especially once the subject is fully immersed in language. The infant's reflection in the mirror creates a fixed image of the body, contrasting with the fluidity of experience. This subjective imaginary state lacks the completeness and clarity of the objective symbolic state represented in language. While the imaginary realm plays a role in dreams, Lacan emphasizes that the symbolic is always present, reflecting the subject's immersion in language and society. Thus, traces of the imaginary ideal ego persist in dream imagery. Lacan describes how the organic discord experienced by infants indicates a natural inadequacy in their reality as understood through language. This discord is reflected in the unease and lack of coordination observed during the early months of infancy. Just like natural forms such as nuts or flower parts have built-in seams for splitting, this primordial discord influences the formation of the self, particularly during the mirror stage. Here, the fragmented body image of the infant evolves into a cohesive but rigid identity, symbolized by what Lacan calls the orthopedic totality. Lacan suggests that breaking free from this rigid identity involves understanding a concept that challenges the fixed nature of identity formation. The ego, formed through language and perception, mirrors the gestalt body image perceived during the mirror stage. This identity construction is akin to a fortress or stadium in dreams, representing the protective armor against natural instincts. Yet there is a constant struggle between the organic and inorganic aspects of the self, echoing a broader tension observed in nature, where all life has an instinct to return to simpler forms. This tension is reflected in human reasoning and artistic expressions, where abstraction and geometrical forms symbolize a longing for life denying organic structures. Freud posited that the fundamental drive in life is towards death, a return to an inorganic state. He suggested that consciousness itself emerged from an earlier state and harbors an instinct of self-negation. According to Lacan, there is a satisfaction derived from integrating the original organic disarray, indicating a vital component of human existence. Reason exhibits a desire to maintain this disarray, preserving the tension between the organic and inorganic, the imagine. This desire in reason perpetuates the notion of discord, preceding harmony, preventing the reconciliation between different aspects of human experience. The formation of the ego in the imaginary is not solely through perception, but also via meconnaissance, a misrecognition, or the mirage of consciousness. Lacan argues that the ego's self-certainty obstructs its ability to perceive itself beyond the objectified ego in which. This self-definition leads to self-alienation, inherited from the mirror stage, where the specular image presents another to the self. This experience shapes the ego's formation in language and its relationship with the other. The desire for self-reinforcement and identity emerges from the intersection between the unconscious subject and the other, manifesting as a conflict between the subject and its mirrored double, ultimately revealing the primordial discord between internal and external worlds. Lacan applied Freud's method of dream analysis to understand how the unconscious works through language. He compares dreams to sentences or rebuses, emphasizing the linguistic structure over the symbolic meaning. According to Lacan, the phonetic elements in dreams play a crucial role in representing the symbolic function of the unconscious. However, understanding dreams involves more than just this. It also requires interpreting the linguistic mechanisms used, such as ellipsis, metaphor, and repetition. These mechanisms allow the dreamer to shape the narrative of their dreams, revealing hidden intentions and desires through the dream discourse. In Lacan's view, the subject's absence in language stems from the process of objectification during the mirror stage of development. The subject becomes identified with language and the universal concepts it represents, akin to Hegel's notion of spirit becoming objectified in objective reality. The ideal ego, formed in the imaginary realm, becomes increasingly inaccessible within the symbolic domain of language. This relationship between the subject in language and the ideal ego is complex, resembling an asymptomatic curve where the subject continuously strives but never fully achieves self-identification. The barrier created by language impedes the subject's ability to fully realize itself, similar to Hegel's concept of absolute spirit, struggling to synthesize objective and subjective realities. In Lacan's theory, the subject experiences a sense of division and self-alienation within the imaginary realm, similar to the way Hegel describes the subject's experience in reason. While Hegel explores how the subject's self-awareness leads to a recognition of its own fragmentation, Lacan emphasizes that the subject's identification with itself in the imaginary is characterized by a lack of true consciousness. This imaginary realm is depicted as being eccentric to any realization of self-consciousness, meaning that the subject's sense of identity is formed through misconceptions rather than true awareness. This results in a perpetual sense of division within the subject. In Hegel's philosophy, the subject's sense of division and alienation is crucial to its formation and self discovery. Reason becomes estranged from itself, leading to the subject's recognition of its own fragmented existence. This process of self awareness is integral to Hegel's dialectical method, where subject discovers itself as both absolute negativity and infinite self affirmation. Similarly, in Lacan's theory, the subject's presence in language is marked by a sense of non presence, as it is objectified and defined by its process of becoming. This highlights the perpetual gap between the subject and its representation in language, echoing the paradox of Zeno's motion and emphasizing the subject's constant state of flux and non-being within linguistic constructs. Freud saw a connection between Hegel's idea of self-negation in reason and unconscious repression. He argued that what the mind represses can sometimes come to consciousness through negation. For example, Freud described how a child's game of making objects disappear and reappear be a way of coping with the absence of the mother. This game, played with words and actions, reflects the child's unconscious feelings about the mother leaving and returning. Language then becomes a way for the child to understand and express its emotions, even when it is not fully aware of them. In Lacan's view, the unconscious is part of the way we communicate and understand the world. He describes it as the part of our thoughts and behaviors that we are not fully aware of, but that still influences us. As we grow, our sense of self is shaped by our interactions with others and by the language we use. This means that our conscious understanding of ourselves is always influenced by deeper unconscious processes. Just like in the Fort Da game, where the child's actions reflect unconscious emotions, our language and perceptions are shaped by unconscious meanings and symbols. Lacan and other philosophers like Plato and Hegel believed that our understanding of the world is shaped by language and concepts. They argued that language creates our perception of reality and structures our thoughts. This means that even before we are born, language plays a role in shaping who we are. Just as we are defined by language, we are also shaped by history. Hegel describes history as the process of making the unconscious aspects of society conscious. It is like a stage where events unfold, revealing the deeper workings of the human mind and society. In this view, historical events are seen as ways to bring unconscious elements into the light of consciousness. Each individual's actions are influenced by their place in history and their larger cultural context. People don't invent their own beliefs and values, they are shaped by the culture around them. So when someone acts, they are often reflecting and carrying out the shared beliefs and goals of their society. This understanding helps explain how history progresses and how